Hey everyone, this is Brian. We are almost ready to start. Just want to give folks a minute or two who might be a few minutes late. We'll get started very soon with introductions and agenda and then the webinar itself. So thanks for joining. All right, it looks like we're starting to get quite the quorum here, which is excellent. This is Brian. We are just waiting for the last few folks to call in, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, I think we're reaching critical mass here. It's 2 minutes after 11, so why don't we go ahead and get started. My name is Brian Schuster. I am with the Gateway, the COGS consulting team, and today I am doing a training webinar for the Gateway Cities Climate Action Planning Framework Toolkit. This is the greenhouse gas emissions tracking toolkit, the Excel-based toolkit that everyone will have access to as they get all the materials. It looks like we're still getting a few people to join. So, okay, I think we're good now. So let me just briefly start over. Thank you for everyone for joining. This is the Gateway Cities Climate Action Planning Framework training webinar for the Greenhouse Gas Toolkit. I'm Brian Schuster. I'm on the consultant team for the COG for the project. Just a couple of quick things before I get started. First of all, I am recording this for future viewing, so hopefully folks can, if they have to leave early, or for folks who can't attend, this will be posted online for your viewing later. Also, I have muted everyone on the line, except for myself, of course. So if you have a question, I'd be glad to answer it as we go through. You don't have to wait to the end to ask your question. So use the chat box through the WebEx interface to ask your question, or just let me know if you have a question. Just type your name or just type something, and I can unmute your line specifically. I can see your names. So except for a few call-in users, I can't tell. But if you'd like to just ask your question over the phone, let me know and I can try to unmute you. Otherwise, go ahead and type your question in the chat box, and I'll be happy to answer your questions as we go. So let's see what else. A quick agenda. I'll be doing a brief introduction and then talking about what the toolkit is and what it can do overall. I'll talk about what it includes, what measures the toolkit includes for reducing greenhouse gases. I'll talk about navigation and macros and table of contents and so forth. I'll talk about the setting up the tool with your background information, socioeconomic data, year of tracking, and so forth. Then I'll talk about setting performance goals and targets for the city and for individual measures. And finally, tracking your performance as you move forward. So once you've set your goals, how you track against those performance targets. Let's see. And then I'll take questions at the end as well if there are other questions that we didn't get to. Let's see, where's my chat box? Okay, but like I said, feel free to ask questions as we go. Great, so the agenda, great. So as we go through, I'd like everyone to think about a few questions. Basically, what are the biggest challenges you hope the toolkit can solve for you and your city? We want the toolkit to be useful. We don't want it to just be a fun Excel spreadsheet that looks pretty but doesn't actually do anything. So as I go through the toolkit, ask yourself that question. What are some of the biggest challenges that you're hoping the toolkit can solve? And if by the end, it seems like I haven't hit that challenge, please let me know what that is, and I can hopefully explain how the toolkit might be able to help you there. I'd also like you to think about, just generally what the toolkit, what its purpose is for you and how it can help you as you go. So very similar, but just to think about what value the toolkit can supply for you and your city as you move forward in the sustainability space. So great. So introduction. I'm Brian Schuster again. There's a training webinar for the toolkit, for the GHG tracking toolkit. So I'll just go through and talk about the tool. So the tool is organized into a couple of different modules. There are the setup module, which is the yellow tabs, or the introduction yellow tabs. The setup is the orange. So that's just background information and setting up. The purple is target selection. The green is for individual measure targets, or what we're calling performance goals. The blue is for actually tracking the progress of your performance goals and your measures. And then the red is your dashboard, which summarizes everything in a nice visually pleasing package to present in reports or on a website or in flyers or however you find it useful. So let's start off with the introduction. The introduction tab, it just summarizes the toolkit itself, basically what I just said, which tabs and their colors and what they do, and it provides kind of a flow chart for how the process of the toolkits works, where you select your target, you select your measures, you can refine your target, and so on. The table of contents is the next tab. This is a clickable table of contents, so each of these buttons brings you to a specific worksheet or tab in the tool. So instructions tab will bring you to the instructions. Background information will bring you to there, and so forth. Each tab also has a return to TOC or return to table of contents button. That'll get you back to the table of contents. There's also a red button, go to dashboard. Every tab has this also, and that will bring you to the dashboard of the tool, which I'll get into a little bit later, but this is the summarization of all of your selections and presentation of results. Great, so this is the table of contents. Every tab has a link, and these are clickable. Instructions tab, as you go through the toolkit, basically this is a summary of what I'm going to be presenting today, but it just walks you step by step through each section of the tool and how to use it and the process. We will also be supplying a user guide along with this. It's basically a PDF user-friendly user guide that just with a lot of screenshots showing you how to go through the tool, and you'll have that along with the toolkit itself to help you walk through the toolkit. There's also a glossary tab, which just summarizes common terms, global warming potential, greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide equivalent, a few terms that are used pretty commonly throughout the toolkit, standard terms and so forth. There's also a resources tab, which provides additional resources for guidance on tracking reductions or additional tools that are out there to help you calculate greenhouse gas emission reductions if this toolkit doesn't supply those, other guidance, other protocols, and so forth. The user guide, which is another component of the Gateway framework, will also supply additional resources. So this is just kind of a summary of resources that might be useful when you're filling out the toolkit. It's not an all-inclusive list, but it should provide some useful things for you as you move through the toolkit itself. Great. So what measures are included is the next thing. We can go, let's see. We have the measures are organized into, right. So they're organized into state, regional, and then local measures. Local measures are grouped into categories of energy efficiency, renewable energy, sustainable transportation, land use and community design, water and wastewater systems, waste reduction and recycling, green infrastructure, parks and urban forestry, and green business and industry. And this is all explained and detailed in the user guide as well. Within each of these categories are individual measures that are appropriate within each overall category. So improve efficiency of existing buildings would be an example of one under energy efficiency. Local clean energy generation is an example of a measure under renewable energy, and this is basically your rooftop solar measure. So I'll go through a couple of examples to show you how the toolkit works, and if you have specific questions about a measure that I don't go over, please let me know, and I can walk you through that measure. Okay, so setup tab is where we get started. So setup is where you select from the drop-down list. Let's see here. City, your city selection, all the cities are here. The year that you're tracking, and basically what this is your current tracking year. And what current tracking year means is just for the tracking component of the toolkit, what's the latest year that you have data available for. So if you want to track, for example, the progress of your solar installations, of your residential solar installations, and you have data on those installations through the year 2017, and that's the latest year you have, then you would select 2017. You can track prior years, so if you have solar data from 2013 through 2017, you would select 2017, and then you can still enter data for previous years. This will just tell the tool that to summarize all of your emissions up through this year, and that way you can report on your most recent data. So that's just what the tracking year means. This can be changed at any point. The setup information, the setup tab also has entries for socioeconomic data. So here you can see population, households, employment, single family, multifamily, non-residential square feet. These are all pre-populated, but can be overwritten. So that actually reminds me of something important about navigation. The cells, we were using a color code to let you know which cells are required for you to enter data into, which is the dark yellow. There are cells that are optional data entries, and these are the light yellow. So these will help refine the toolkit calculations, but are not necessary. We have default values or assumptions based on the data we've collected for each city. So you don't need to update those, but as you move forward, you may want to update data as more data becomes available, or as emission factors or global warming potentials or other baseline assumptions change, you can make those changes. So for example, the population, households, employment data is the light yellow color. So that means you can update these if you wish, but you don't have to. In a few years, new forecasts will likely be available from SCAG or from the state, and so you can update the forecasts with that new information. It also shows the setup, I'm still on the setup tab, so your utility renewable percentage and non-renewable percentages. The toolkit calculates emission reductions for electricity savings, and this is where those assumptions are coming from. So as Southern California Edison gets cleaner, as their renewable portfolio changes over the years, you can enter that information moving forward. As you can see, it's populated through the year 2016 because that's the latest year where data was available, but that will obviously change as new data becomes available. More on utility information, which utility supplies your electricity. These are all, again, the rest of this tab is basically optional. Emission factors and global warming potentials and conversions and other factors. You can go in and see exactly what factors the tool is using, where the source is, in other words, where it's coming from, what the source of that information is. And so you can, if you want to update these, you can follow the link and see if there's new information available. So, okay, let's see. Sorry about that. Okay, great, there we go. Setup tab. Okay, yeah, I think that's good for the setup tab. If you have questions on this, feel free to ask, type in your chat box. For those who who've joined in the last few minutes. I'm going through the webinar right now. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them. You can type them in as we go. No need to wait till the end. I've muted everyone to avoid distractions or feedback or other audio issues. So that's why I have the chat box open. I'll be looking at that as we go. So, okay, the next tab on the setup section is for the inventory and forecast. So this is where your city's emissions are reported. These are just your baseline inventories for 2010, and then your forecast moving forward all the way through 2040, based on our forecast, the forecasting that we've done. You can update these as you do new inventories if you have them. These numbers are the same numbers as reported in ClearPath for 2010. So if you do a new ClearPath inventory, you can update these numbers. Again, these are pre-populated, but they can be overwritten. There's some visualization. A lot of these graphs you may be familiar with. They'll also be repeated in some of the other Gateway framework materials. But these are kind of nice summaries and charts of emissions by sector that you can pull out and put in, whatever materials you might want, whether that's a website or a flyer or educational material or a sustainability plan or a climate action plan or whatever you might want to use them for. So kind of some nice visualizations showing your emissions by year, your forecast, and how your emissions are declining based on state measures and other things. The next section of the tool is the target selection part. So these are the purple tabs. This module of the toolkit allows you to select a citywide target. So this is for the entire city. You can select targets for 3 future years, 2020, which is almost upon us, 2030, and 2040. The target guidance tab summarizes the types of targets that you can use, the rationale for each, and recommendations for what you might want to select. There's no set in stone target to select. There's no specific number that you need to select. The state has specific targets, but it only recommends targets for a local jurisdiction. So you have the purview to select your own target. And there are a lot of potential targets that can be consistent with state level targets. Every city is different. Every city is growing at different rates. Some cities aren't really growing at all. And each city has a different emissions profile. So that's why the toolkit is flexible when it comes to selecting targets. The target selection tab is where you actually do the target selection. This part of the tab where you actually select your target. So we supply 3 options: % below your baseline emissions, per capita or per service population is an efficiency metric, which kind of normalizes emissions to the number of residents and employees you have in the city. And then the third target is % below business as usual forecast. So the chart here shows you what your target is moving forward. Here are your 2010 emissions. The green bar is the target based on your selection over here. You can see it decline through future years. The stacked bars are your reductions. State reductions are in this yellow color, this yellow-orange color. These are pre-calculated for everybody. So these are things like PAVLI fleet vehicle emission standards, the renewable portfolio standard that all the utilities have to comply with. And so you basically, every city gets their own credit. The blue is regional. There are a few regional, like the SCAG's transportation plan, and then the purple is your local reductions. And I've pre-populated this example tool with some to show you what that would look like. The orange hash mark is the gap, basically the additional amount that you need in order to achieve the target that you selected. So you can see that for 2020, there is no gap, which means our 2020 target has been achieved. For 2030, however, we're not quite there. So in order to get there, we can do essentially one of two things. We can make our targets, our individual measure performance selections more stringent. We can pick more measures, we can make them more aggressive, and that will make this purple bar grow bigger. The other thing we can do is adjust the target. So you can raise this target bar. Perhaps this target is a bit too aggressive for your city, you can't quite get there, so you can adjust your 2030 target. As you can see, I did there. Each selection has 3 options: 2020, 2030, and 2040. Let's see. Can we select by area? Let's do distinct areas. Getting a question from Bell. I'm not quite sure what you mean by area. I assume you mean it's like a subset of the city or areas within the city. If that's your question, then the toolkit cannot do that. It's a city level tool. You can still track measures for individual sections of your city, however. So basically, if you have solar installations for one part of your city and you only want to track that, then absolutely you can track that separately. But as far as emissions go at the city level, it's all reported at the city level. Reductions are reported at the city level. So you do have some customization as far as measure tracking and data tracking, but the baseline is for the whole city. If that didn't answer your question, please let me know. I'd be happy to provide a different response. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so tool, targets. So per capita, per service population, just to demonstrate what that would look like, I could click on it, and I've pre-populated this with values which you can change. So you can see that in the examples I selected, the 2020 target is now more strict, more aggressive, but the 2030 target is less. And you can adjust these. So, maybe I want a more aggressive 2020 target, a more aggressive 2030 target, or reverse of that, maybe I want something a little easier to achieve. Maybe that's a little too easy to achieve. Well, you can see as I update these numbers, your target changes. So the tool is kind of structured to be iterative. It's an iterative process. As you go through it and you fill it out, these bars will change. You can see how hard it is to reach targets, how easy it is to reach targets, what additional level of effort you need to achieve your targets. It gives you feedback, in other words. You don't have to wait until the very end to see how achievable a target is. You can see it change in real time, which is kind of nice. The rest of the tab gives you just more information about what you've selected here. The actual amount of reductions that you've selected. So for example, for 2020, based on my selections, it's 57,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas that I need to reduce for 2020. For 2030, it's over 180,000 metric tons. And that number is essentially the stacked amount of bar here to get to this target. We have some other graphics showing your business as usual, your target trend, and your actual trend as you reduce emissions. And then a table showing reductions by measure, which just support what this graph is showing you. Great, so that's the target selection module. I'm going to move on to individual measure performance goals. If you have questions about the target selection module, please ask them. As I mentioned earlier, in case you missed it, I put everyone on mute just to streamline the process. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat box through WebEx, or if you let me know, I can find you in my participant list and unmute you, and you can ask your question over the phone. But the chat box is a good option. So feel free to ask your question in the chat box as we move forward. Moving on to the green tabs, these are the performance measure selection and performance goal module. This is where you actually select individual targets for each measure. There's a prioritization tab, which allows you to basically come up with a prioritization scheme for measures. So GHG reduction potential is only one of the options for prioritization. Each measure has lots of co-benefits, and you can select the importance of each of those co-benefits here, and the tool helps you prioritize measures not just based on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions they reduce, but also on the co-benefits. So for example, improving air quality and public health, creating jobs and improving the local economy, disadvantaged communities, and climate change resilience. You can select from 1 to 5 for each of these, and you can also enter your readiness to develop a climate action plan, low, medium, and high, and then it will rank for you each measure in the toolkit. It'll give you a total score, a weighted score based on your selections, and this allows you to kind of focus in on the top 5 or the top 10 measures that you think are most effective and important for you. It also shows your emission reductions for each year, so you can kind of see the score and compare it to the emission reductions. There's some visualizations here showing you the performance goal and the actual reductions achieved by each of those measures, ranked in terms of your performance, or ranked in terms of your priority. So EE1, RE1, it's ranked left to right. So you can kind of see, as you're ranking your measures, which measures visually are giving you the most reductions. So you can see EE1, I've ranked it number 1, but it's not giving me a whole lot of reductions right now. RE2 is my number 2 measure, and it's actually doing pretty well. So that can help you kind of maybe refocus your strategies around specific measures. The remainder of the green tabs allow you to select performance targets for specific measures. So I'll profile energy efficiency and perhaps renewable energy as 2 good examples that are easily understandable. Each of these green tabs has a couple of sections. There's an instructions section, which just describes what to do, step 1, step 2, step 3. Here's my color coding. You can refer back to this so you don't have to go back to the instructions. There's a dashboard kind of summarizing my 3 energy efficiency measures, the reductions. These are in metric tons of CO2 equivalent achieved by each measure in each of my future years, a breakdown of, for each of my future years, which measure is contributing how much. And then these bar charts show essentially for all of your local reductions, what portion are due to my energy efficiency measures. So right now, in 2020, 3% of my local reductions are attributed to these 3 measures. And as you update these numbers, these will change. Renewable energy is another example. So based on the selections in this version of the tool, 7% of my emission reductions in 2020 are attributed to renewable energy. So it just kind of gives you a scale, how effective is this tab toward my total reductions at the local level. There's some summary information here, which just explains explains what each measure is, what its co-benefits are. This is just a summary of information. You'll get the measure templates through the CAPFramework program that will have much more detail. But this is just kind of a point to, oh, what does green building mean? It means essentially these couple of things. These are the types of programs that can fall under green building and the types of actions that you can implement at the city level. Then we get into the actual performance goal selections. So this is where you select your aspirations, essentially, your targets or your performance goals for each individual measure. So we'll take improve efficiency of existing buildings as an example. This measure is broken into 3 categories: single-family homes, multifamily homes, and non-residential buildings. For each of those 3 categories, there are data entry points. So these dark yellow are the required entries. The light yellow are optional. So what these numbers mean is total cumulative number of homes retrofitted since 2010. So because the baseline year is 2010, everything is compared back to 2010. So if you retrofitted 100 homes each year from 2010 through 2017, then we'll have 700 homes retrofit by the year, or we'll have 700 homes retrofit through 2018 or through 2017, and 1,000 homes retrofit through 2020. So if that's your goal, total cumulative homes retrofit in the last, from 2010 through 2020, you'll enter 1,000 here. The same approach applies to the future to the future target year. So by 2030, 3,000 homes will be retrofit for energy efficiency, and by 2020, 4,000 homes will be retrofit. If you're unclear about what this is exactly asking for, there are these help boxes here. You can click these red buttons, and they'll explain what we're actually asking for. So total cumulative number of homes, that are being retrofit from the year 2010 to each target year. So it just kind of helps, these help boxes help explain, what these numbers mean, what we're looking for, whether it's cumulative or annual, and so forth. There are also some notes to kind of guide you through the process as you go. You would do the same for multifamily homes and non-residential buildings. This is square footage. And then if you have additional information, you can enter it in these light yellow cells. They aren't required, but they will help improve the calculation. So for example, this is the % electricity savings for each retrofit. So if you have good energy efficiency retrofit tracking data, and you know that the average retrofit saves 20% on electricity and 25% on natural gas, you can enter those factors, and the tool will use these instead of the default values. The green cells show you your reductions, greenhouse gas reductions for each measure based on your selection. So these would be essentially your target reductions. So in 2020, my target reductions are 1,242 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. By 2030, it's 2,143. As you update these numbers, those reductions will change in real time. So you do this for each measure. So select your aspirations, your performance goals for each future year, and you would do that for each category of emission reductions for each measure. So renewable energy, we would do it for solar, number of buildings installing solar, single family, multifamily, community choice aggregation, and other clean utility energy offerings. So if you're supplying 100% renewable energy to your residents and commercial businesses, you can enter those type of information here, and the number of homes or % participation in each program that you plan to offer, and so forth. So that's what the green tabs do. Measure by measure, go through and select your performance goals for each measure. Question. Stephanie asks, how can I find out how much electricity is saved from single-family retrofits in 1 year? Do I get that from Southern California Edison? That is one way you can do it. Southern California Edison will usually give you a utility report for the whole city. It won't tell you how much was saved due to specific programs necessarily. The reports you'll get from Edison will just say in 2018, your residential kilowatt-hour supply was 500,000 kilowatt hours. It won't tell you that that of that 500,000, 150,000 was reduced through energy efficiency. You can get those reductions through individual energy efficiency programs like PACE. There are reporting metrics that PACE can supply to you for energy saved through retrofits. The other thing you can do if you don't have PACE data, or if you're looking at other programs that may not be tracking electricity reductions, if you know how many retrofits were supplied just through a rebate program, just tracking number of rebates, or through a utility partnership, they may be able to give you the number of retrofits that were implemented through a program. If it's an official program, there should be at least data on how many retrofits were supplied or performed through that program, because usually people are applying for rebates or other financial incentives, and so there's a record of how many of those were offered. If you don't actually have the electricity savings, you can use the tool to generate default assumptions for that. So for example, if you knew 150 homes performed a retrofit in 2013, but you don't know how much electricity they saved, you can on the tracking tab, you can use the default values, or the resources tab can help you find typical numbers for what a general retrofit will save as far as electricity use. And I'll show you what that looks like on the tracking tab in a moment. So hopefully that helps. Great, so I'm going to proceed on to the actual tracking of the measures. Once we've selected our performance goals, these are my planned reductions. Let's go and see what my actual reductions look like and tracking them. So the tracking tabs are colored in blue, and as I mentioned on the targets tab, there's a regional and a state, and these are pre-calculated for each city. So state measures are renewable portfolio standards, the Pavley vehicle standards, Title 24. As you know, these building Title 24 standards are revised every 3 years. So new buildings are built to new standards, just required to through code, independent of any city action. It's just state code, so you get benefits from that. And then short-lived climate pollutants as well. Everybody gets a reduction. Or short-lived climate pollutants. Regional, similar. There's the RTP-SCS SCAG's Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy that affects transportation in the entire SCAG region. So while cities do have to participate in some of these to achieve some of the reductions, it's a regional credit, so you get credit for that. You can scroll down to see the actual reductions that you're getting from each state measure if you like, but there's no need to edit anything on these tabs unless you have data that you want to refine. So you have the option, but you don't need to. Each of the blue tabs, similar to the green tabs, has an instructions section, a summary section, which just shows you how your tracking is going. So because I selected 2017 as my tracking year, it shows me the emission reductions achieved in 2017, and it compares it to the target for each future year. So for example, it makes a little bit less sense on the state measure. We'll go to energy efficiency for example's sake. So improve efficiency of existing buildings. Based on my tracking inputs, which I'll get to in a minute, I've achieved 905 metric tons of CO2 reduction. My target is 1,756. So I'm 52% of the way to my target for 2020. So this just kind of gives you a summary of how are you doing? Am I above my target? Am I below my target? Am I meeting my target? And then there's a bar chart here showing you what I've achieved compared to my planned achievements. So since we're on the energy efficiency tab and we've been talking about energy efficiency, I will continue down here. Okay, so we're looking at improve efficiency of existing buildings. This is the retrofit measure. So on the tracking tab, you have a couple of just kind of overall cells you can populate with implementation information, like your measure priority, who's responsible, where your funding source is coming from, co-benefits. This is qualitative information that you can just use to track, whatever you want to track for a specific measure. There's a box for user notes, who gave you the data, when new data is coming out, what information was used to populate this tab, etc. Then you get into the actual tracking section. So at the top of each tracking section, there's essentially a summary which shows you your greenhouse gas reductions. These are calculated based on the numbers you track for each year in the tool. So you can see in 2011, I've reduced emissions by 181 metric tons of CO2 based on the numbers I've entered down below. You can see those numbers change moving forward. And then it tells you how you're doing against your performance goal. So remember, we selected our performance goal over here of 2,000 homes for 2020 being retrofit. So this tells me how many homes, how I'm trending against that target. So I'm doing pretty well up through 2014, and then in 2015, I'm, as you can see, I've stopped entering data, and so I'm trending a little bit below my target. Here is where you enter on an annual basis how many retrofits were performed. So to go back to Stephanie's question, if you don't actually have the amount of electricity saved, but you do know how many homes were retrofit, you enter the home retrofit number here. So for example, 2012, I know that 400 homes either applied for a retrofit rebate, actually did a retrofit, or however I'm getting that data. And but I don't know how much electricity they reduce. The toolkit will make that assumption for you. So that's all you need to enter is 400, and it'll calculate your reductions. If you do know how much electricity was saved, you can enter that in these optional cells. So here, total electricity savings each year for all of your retrofits. Maybe I know it was 50,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, and the number updates because I have more accurate information. So if you don't enter numbers down here, and these are all blank, it'll just assume defaults. If you want to know what those defaults are, you can scroll down a little bit, and you can click on Show Calculations. Each measure has these two buttons, Performance Goals and Show Calculations. So if you're curious, if you want to know how the tool calculates this number, 388, based on the 400 I've entered, you can click on Show Calculations. That will open up a bunch of rows for you, which show the assumptions the tool is making. So assumptions like the average % electricity savings per retrofit, or the average % natural gas savings per retrofit. So that's where I could overwrite up here if I want, or I could overwrite down here if I know that instead actually I'm better than 20%, I'm 30%. And instead of 25%, maybe I'm 40%. So my retrofits are actually more effective than the default, so you can change those numbers and it'll update your calculations. Each measure has a selection of values, assumptions, the default value that we're using in the toolkit, and where we get that value. So you can change the default value that you're using, but you can still see what the default value was. So if I change to 40%, I can still see that, oh, the default value was 25%. Maybe I want to go back to the default value, and I can do that without worrying about accidentally deleting a default value. And then the calculations follow. So these are step-by-step calculations for each year, taking your entries on the setup tab, like your utility emission factors, the number of homes that are present in your city, and the selections you picked above to calculate reductions for number of homes retrofitted, reductions per home, electricity savings in kilowatt hours, and then eventually natural gas savings and therms, and then eventually greenhouse gas reductions based by utility and then overall. You scroll all the way down to the end. This is broken down into, my individual categories. So single family, multifamily, residential, non-residential, and then at the bottom you'll see your total reductions achieved for each year. The performance goal button just shows you what your performance goals are based on what you've selected in the green tab over here. So this shows you moving forward through each target year, how many homes you are planning to retrofit, what your greenhouse gas reductions are for those retrofits, and so forth. So this is where these are the numbers that are used to generate these percentages. Am I trending on my target, or am I not trending on my target? Note that these are all calculated numbers and these cells will be locked. So you won't be able to change the calculations in the actual cells, but you can see what the calculations are by clicking on the cell to show you the equation, and you can change the assumptions that the calculations use. So we can hide them and they go away, and we can go on to the next measure. So to follow up with the question on the savings per home, you can enter those numbers here. You can use defaults. So that's how you would adjust if you don't have actual data from your PACE program or your HERO program or whatever program you're using to track. There's a tracking tab for each individual measure. So that's energy efficiency. There's one for renewable energy. Similarly, how many homes installed solar each year, how many non-residential buildings installed solar, and then what my assumptions are for each solar installation. Kilowatt size, kilowatt hours saved or generated by the solar panels each year, and so forth. And the tool, the same format flows through each measure. Some measures have lots of entries, and some measures only have a few. It just depends on the level of detail of each measure for tracking. Great, so that's a summary of the tracking tab. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box, and I will do my best to respond. I'll give folks a minute, and I will move on to the dashboard reporting. The dashboard is and I will go back if you have questions on anything I covered, so feel free to type your questions at any point. The dashboard there's a single tab. It's colored red here. Every tab in Toolkit has a red Go to Dashboard button. So you can always skip to the dashboard to see your progress. The dashboard reports your target, it reports your business as usual emissions, it reports the reductions that you're tracking based on the blue tabs, and summarizes everything in kind of a user-friendly, visually pleasing section. You can kind of summarize things. So the first chart here is a summary of moving forward through time from 2010 through 2030. I've selected 2030 as my out year just for sake of visualization, but you can select any of your out years here to kind of compress or expand the chart. My BAU forecast is here, this orange line. You can see emissions increasing each year. My target is the green line. You can see that decreasing. And my the gray line here is my actual reduction. So based on what I've entered in the blue tabs for tracking, you know, my 300 homes retrofit in 2012 and 400 homes retrofit in 2013. And so by 2020, I have, you know, 1,000 homes or 2,000 homes retrofit. That's all adding up into this purple bar and reducing your emissions. So you can see how you're actually trending against your target. So I'm doing pretty well in this example through 2020. You can see my actual emissions are below my target, but then in 2022, 2023, it kind of flipped. And my target is now more aggressive than my actual reduction. So you can see, essentially, you can see what your target gap is and how well the city is doing toward meeting the target moving forward. This chart shows essentially the same thing, just a little bit, maybe a little bit less detail, showing how you're trending through the tracking year of 2017 in this example against your target and against your BAU forecast. So doing pretty well as we move forward. This chart shows your reductions by sector. So this is broken down into, you know, overall sector, building energy, transportation, waste, water, and then my target for 2030 and my target gap. If you noticed in my first chart, 2030, I'm not quite there. There's a gap here. So that's being reflected in this chart. You can select the year again. So if I want to see my target gap for 2020, I've reduced. I don't have a target gap. I'm already well below my target. For 2040, I have a bigger gap to get to. For 2030, I'm doing pretty well, but I have a little bit further to go. So this just breaks it down by sector for you. And then within each sector, there are summary charts that you can scroll down to see. These are my reductions for each of my major sectors. In my emissions, you can see which sectors are doing better than which other sectors. Individual measures, so energy efficiency and conservation, how I'm doing against my performance goal. So I'm 80% of the way to my 2020 performance goal for this selection of measures and 68% of the way to my 2030 performance goal. These little heads-up displays are presented for each overall category of emissions, renewable energy, water and wastewater, et cetera. And then there are ones for individual measures. So above were summary charts for overall sectors. Here you can see them for each individual measure. So efficiency of existing buildings, I'm 40% of the way to my 2020 target and 39% of the way to my 2030 target. I've conducted 1,850 total retrofits so far through the tracking year of 2017, and I've reduced 687 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So it's just kind of a snapshot of how well this measure is doing. The percent of local reductions attributed to this measure. So this measure is 2% of my total local reductions. My renewable energy one is almost a quarter, 23.5. So I'm doing pretty, like, renewable energy is doing a lot for me. I'm achieving my target. I'm well above. I'm reducing lots of emissions. These visualizations help to show you, you know, what's effective and what's not effective. And then at the end, there's a table showing the actual reductions by measure for each of my main target years, and then there's a chart at the end summarizing measure reductions by overall sector. So state measures, waste, water, renewable energy, and so forth. And then a table showing reductions each year, in case you're curious about the numbers for each individual year. So that's a summary of the dashboard. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. We have about 10 minutes left in the webinar. So So that's the walkthrough I wanted to present on the toolkit. We have another 10 minutes or so for questions. I can go back and talk about specific measures I didn't address, transportation or waste, or if there's something that, anything that came up during the target setting or the measure prioritization or any of that. Feel free to type your question in the chat box and let me know if you have a question. And I'll remind folks at the beginning, I asked everyone to think about what they want to get out of the toolkit. What's most useful for you from this toolkit, and what are the biggest challenges you're facing as a city that you're hoping this toolkit can help you solve? So from framing the usefulness of this toolkit through that lens, maybe you might have a question about something you are hoping the toolkit can do, or maybe it something that you want the toolkit to do for you, or is it climate action plan related? Is it just tracking the progress of measures? Is it for staff reports or funding, or conducting new greenhouse gas inventories? If any of those things resonate with you, let me know, and let me know if you have any questions. I also wanted to say that the UCLA Energy Atlas supplied a lot of data for the inventories with regard to electricity and natural gas data that we use to prepare the inventories and then form the baseline for the forecasts, and also a lot of the energy-related reduction measures. So thanks to UCLA for providing a great data set of energy data. And then I also wanted to thank ICF, another consulting firm that prepared the LARC regional inventories for the county for the year 2010, all 88 cities in the county, and they were helpful in supplying us with inventory data to support the project. So thanks to those two organizations for helping us out. One thing that you can do as you work on selecting your goals for measures before you actually get into tracking for selecting your target, the iterative nature of the tool allows you to kind of change your target and change your performance metrics over time to see how effective you are at reaching your target. So let's take 2030 as an example. So my target gap is, it's not huge, but it's sizable. And I need overall 182,000 metric tons to reduce in order to get to that 2030 target. So one thing you can do is, okay, so how do I get there? We know renewable energy is giving a big bang for me for my 2030 target. So let's look at that. Right now I have 2,000 homes, single-family homes, and 2,000 multifamily homes installing solar, which represent 31% and 25% of my total homes in the city. So that's a sizable percentage, but maybe I want to get up to 50%. Maybe by 2030 I want 50%, or even 75% of homes to have installed solar. So I can update my numbers. That's probably a little too high. 63%. Let's try 3,000, maybe 3,500. Oops. Okay, so I've increased my number of homes installing solar. Let's see how that affected my target. It went down a little bit. Cool. Okay, let's keep going. Renewable energy. This is actually, I got a question here. Have any cities implemented this tool, or is it new to everyone? We haven't released the tool yet to the cities. I provided a beta version to a few cities a few months ago. We went through a beta testing period. So a few cities do have access to the beta version. We'll be supplying the final version within the next week or two, sometime this month. And so I don't think anyone's has actually used it yet. That may not be correct. I don't know if anyone's been using the beta version, but there are other tools out there. The ICLEI ClearPath tool does allow you to track reductions. It's a pretty broad level. There aren't a lot of details, but it can be used. So I know some cities are using ClearPath or other tools to track, but as far as I know, people aren't using this tool quite yet. For projects that add parks or open space or trees, can that be counted in the tool? Yes, it can. Good question. Let's see. The green infrastructure, parks, urban forestry, and agriculture measure, or strategy area, I should say, has a tree planting measure. So this is where you can actually enter the number of trees that you either plan to plant or have actually planted. So for example, right now I've selected a target of 1,000 trees, planting 1,000 trees by 2020. That's my target. My target for 2030 is 2,000 trees. If you go into the tracking tab, you can enter the actual number of trees that you've planted. So right now I've put in 500 trees basically per year. So 500 trees planted in 2010 and 2011, 500 in 2012, all the way through my tracking year of 2017, which is actually a lot better than my target. So I've already planted, 4,000 trees between 2010 and 2017, and achieved 104 metric tons of reduction through added sequestration and shade benefits. So not only do trees sequester carbon, but if they're planted next to buildings, they can provide shade benefits, and that means that you need to use your air conditioning less frequently. And so you actually get an energy reduction through tree planting as well. So the tool shows, again, the assumptions made in selecting and turning a number of trees into a carbon reduction and the calculation. So if you know how many trees you planted, you can track that. Good question. Oh, question, I missed a question. What would you say is an estimate of the staff time needed to set this up for the average size city? Also a very good question. So the tool is pretty much set up based on your inventory and your forecast. So what you need to do is select your target, select the citywide target, and then select performance goals. It depends on the level of data that you have for tracking. So if you're just using the tool to set a target, then it will take less time to set up. If you're using the tool to select a target and also track performance, then it will take you longer. And it just depends on how many measures you're implementing. So for example, if I just want to set a target for the city, that could take 5 minutes. It could take 30 minutes. It could take maybe a few hours if you want to play around with various targets, but it's a pretty quick process. If you want to select targets for each measure, pick the measures you want to implement. Maybe out of the 25 measures in the toolkit, you want to implement 10 of them. Then however long it takes you to enter your targets, it's probably going to take you longer to decide what targets to implement than it will to actually enter them in the tool. Entering the targets is pretty quick. You have only a handful of cell data entry points for each measure. So you could probably get through each measure in 5 or 10 minutes or less. But coming up with those numbers will take you longer. So what does 3,000 homes retrofit mean? Is that achievable or is it not achievable? Making that decision is probably harder and will be more time consuming than actually entering it into the tool. So the data entry goes pretty quickly. It's, the decision making is a bit more time consuming. It will take longer to actually track the performance of your measures because the tool asks for annual data, and a lot of the data is optional. So if you're data oriented and you have a lot of really good data, then it will take you time to set your numbers for each year, especially if you have a lot of the optional data like actual kilowatt hours saved or size of solar panels, not just the number of solar panels, but the actual kilowatts saved. So that could take a lot more time for each measure, especially if you're trying to parse large data sets of information. So it will vary, I would say, from the most basic, maybe an hour or two to just set up a target and update some of the background information, through tens of hours if you're tracking a bunch of measures for a bunch of years. Somewhere in that range would be my best guess. Does the tool count? Oh, we're into sequestration. Does the tool account for variation in sequestration potential by tree type? We have, it's not super detailed, but we have organized it in a way that we hope is most useful for cities. So we've grouped them not by species, but by tree type. So street trees, park trees, residential trees, and then a tree average. So because you're going to get different benefits from different types of trees, a park tree will not give you the kind of shade benefits that a residential tree will get, and same with a street tree. You may get some shade benefits from a street tree, but it won't be as much as a residential tree. You'll get similar sequestration potential, but it will still vary a little bit because a park tree will grow at a different rate than a residential tree typically, and the species are a little bit different. So we don't provide it at a species level, but you can overwrite these defaults if you have species level data. So for each of these entries, for each of our tree type, we provide a citation. The tree data is based on the Million Trees Los Angeles information, which was a study conducted for the LA, so it's local, a regionally local value. You can peruse this information. Perhaps in a year or two, there will be new information available, and you can update these numbers. If you have specific species that you're trying to track, one thing you could do is do your own offline calculation. If you have 3 species that you're planting, you could calculate kind of an average sequestration value for each of those trees and then update that number in these cells for your local profile of tree species if it varies from the numbers we've entered here. So there's a little bit of specificity, but it's not at the fine grain level of species. There are tools available to do species level calculation though that can help you update these defaults if you like. iTree is one. The tree carbon calculator is another. I think I've put those resources in the resources tab. So you can use, and if I haven't, I will. Yeah, tree carbon calculator and iTree, those are 2 that can help. Great. Well, we're at 12:02 now. I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer if there are other questions. But otherwise, for those still on the line, thank you so much for joining. We're really pleased to present this tool to all of you. We're really hopeful that this will be a useful tool, that it's user-friendly, that it will help you develop your sustainability plans and your programs, whether you opt to build a climate action plan or not. And we're really excited to provide this tool along with the rest of the materials for the Gateway Planning Framework, CAPFramework. And I have recorded this webinar, so I will post the recording. We'll post it for folks to review, and along with the tool itself and the user guide. So those materials are coming soon. So thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate your time, and I'll stick around for a little bit longer in case there are any more questions. Great, we have a couple more questions. Stephanie, you've been updated. This is a good point. I've updated inventory for beyond 2010. How can I add those numbers? So some cities are doing new inventories, and more cities probably will. So the tool itself does not calculate emissions. So if you have a new inventory, say from ClearPath or another tool, you can enter those inventory numbers in the inventory and setup forecast tab, but it won't calculate these numbers for you. So in other words, you can't plug in new electricity data into the tool anywhere. It won't calculate those emissions for you. But if you have done that outside of the tool, you can enter those numbers here. The other thing you can do is on the individual tracking tabs, you can view the numbers that, let's see, would be an example. So here's an example. So for the energy efficiency measure, we have a default value of basically kilowatt hours used per home. The average single family home in the city of Paramount is about 3,450 kilowatt hours per household. And that's based on the UCLA data from 2010. So if you've conducted a new inventory, say for 2015, and this number's gone down, maybe it's 3,100 at an average, you can update that number here. And so you can use new inventory data to adjust the default numbers. all of the activity data from the 2010 inventories is in the tool. So you can actually go change activity data. It's a little bit more complicated, but the data is all here. So if you want to go further than just plugging in your new emissions for each sector and then creating tracking visualizations to see how your actual inventories are doing, if you want to actually go into the back end of the tool and change things like actual numbers, VMT traveled, kilowatt hours consumed, solid waste tons used, that can all be customized. It's just a little more involved than just entering or just changing assumptions on these tabs here. So the tool can be fully customized to any inventory. Is basically the answer. There's a high level customization, which I've kind of explained here on these 2 or 3 tabs, and then there's a detailed customization within the back end of the tool with all of your data, and that can all be updated. So we're hoping to make this tool as transparent and useful moving forward. We know that things become obsolete if they aren't updated, so we wanted to try to make this tool as updatable as possible, so it can be useful in the years to come. Great. Any other questions? Happy to take them. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much for participating again. We're excited about this tool, and we hope it's useful. And we will be finishing up the materials, the framework materials this month, and supplying the toolkit along with all of the supporting guidance materials to everyone shortly. So thank you again for participating, and hope everyone has a great week and a lovely holiday.